Okay, welcome to the first lecture for Introduction to Cognitive Science. I'm your professor, Mark Phelan, and today we're going to be talking about the evolution of human beings. So as we discussed during our first meeting on Monday, cognitive science is the study of human minds. So what we're really interested in cognitive science is figuring out how human minds work, what they're constituted by, and what are some of their natural features. So to get a good sense of this, to get started with this, we need to have a sense of what humans are as natural evolved organisms. And the point of today's lecture is to tell us a little bit about that. Some information that hopefully will be cleared up through the discussion on Friday or Wednesday or Thursday or whichever day we're meeting on to discuss Yuval Harari's book, Homo sapiens, or Sapiens, and the evolution of us. Okay, so let's get started with a little background, and we'll start with kind of the broad picture here. So almost 4 billion years ago, biological organisms first appeared on Earth. Mammals themselves evolved about 178 million years ago, and they scampered around under the feet of dinosaurs until the dinosaurs died out around 65 million years ago. Now, the first primates appeared around the same time when the dinosaurs were dying off. Our last common ancestor with the chimpanzees then lived about 6 million years ago. So around 6 million years ago, an ape gave birth to 2 children. One of these children was the great-grandmother of all chimpanzees, and the other was the great-grandmother of all human beings. But of course, this is 6 million years ago, so there's still a lot of evolutionary history to go. We can see here on this chart, down at the bottom here, the millions of years are listed. So we start out with 8 million years here on the left. And as we were just learning, chimpanzees and human beings split off around 6 million years ago. That was the time of our last common ancestor. And what does it mean to be a human, right? Well, we have us way down here, so we can see Homo sapiens down here at the bottom, and that's us. But are we the only humans? Well, no. What it means to be a human is to be part of this group, part of the organisms that fall under the genus Homo, okay? And there are many animals that are closely related enough to us that they fall into that genus, that they are in the genus Homo. And we can see these organisms here. So we have Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, Homo erectus, and so on. And then down here, the last common ancestor that we know of that we split from was the Neanderthal, Homo neanderthalensis. And that happened, not too long ago, about 70,000, about 100 to 200,000 years ago is when we split from Homo neanderthalensis. Okay, so where did all this happen? Well, we know that, and this is a little outdated, this comes from the video that I put up for you to watch. I thought it was a good introduction to this, but we now believe that Homo erectus evolved around 2 million years ago, and that they spread out from Africa here into Europe up in the north and into Asia down in the south. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, evolved in Africa about 200,000 years ago. And Eastern Africa was kind of their base of operation for many, many years. We know that, that a group of Homo sapiens tried to venture east into Asia about 100,000 years ago, and they were driven back into Africa. And it wasn't until about 30,000 years later, until what we're going to refer to as the cognitive revolution, which we'll talk about in just a minute, that humans developed the capacity to really challenge these descendants of Homo erectus, who were living in Europe and Asia, for supremacy of these 2 continents as well, and eventually for supremacy of the Eastern Hemisphere. So we know then that Homo sapiens left Africa, and they didn't leave Africa here. This is spread. Of course, there were still Homo sapiens in Africa at this time. But we know that Homo sapiens spread from Africa into Europe and into Asia between 60 and 80,000 years ago. So your book talks about the cognitive revolution as occurring about 70,000 years ago. And that's right square in the middle of what we have from the video that you watched as well. Now, when Homo sapiens left Africa this time, they sort of rolled across the whole continent and eventually the whole world. But when they left Africa, they encountered a variety of different members of the genus Homo. And so, for example, in Europe, they encountered Homo neanderthalensis. In Asia, Eastern Asia, down here around Melanesia, they discovered or they encountered Denisovans, a mysterious kind of other relative of ours. And of course, in Africa, there were various other kinds of Homo sapiens, sorry, not Homo sapiens, of members of the Homo genus that were developing around the same time and that were living in Africa at the time. So there were a variety of different members of the genus Homo. And a question that Yuval Harari's book asks is, well, what happened to these other members of our genus, to these other humans? So we can see here the lifespan of some of these different human species. And clearly the lifespan of these human species was in some cases very much greater than our own. But at this point, they have all died out. Sorry, I'm talking here of the lifespan of the different species of human beings, so not individual humans, of course. So if we look at 3 million years ago, we can see that Homo floresiensis evolved on a small island in the Philippines. Interesting case study mentioned in your book. And they lived until almost 15,000 years ago, I believe, is what's expected or what's thought now. We see also that various different kinds of Homo sapiens evolved and died out. And so there's a question, well, what happened to all these other human beings? And here, actually on this scale, you can see that this gray bar represents the age of Homo sapiens, the years that the species Homo sapiens has been around, which again is about 200,000 years. Though there will be some important evolutionary differences in there that we'll talk about in just a minute. Well, it seems that what happened in each of these cases, or in many of these cases, is that the extinction of different of these human species roughly corresponded to migration of human beings into the areas that these other species had called home for generations. So it seems that the death of many other members of the Homo genus occurred concurrently with encounters with human beings. And so that raises a question, well, what happened to these other species? And why did other species of humans disappear as Homo sapiens spread into their territory? Well, there are two primary theories, two hypotheses that Harari discusses in the reading that you looked at for today. So these two hypotheses are, well, the replacement theory, and then also the interbreeding theory. So according sorry, let me just basically say a word about what each of these theories say. So the replacement theory essentially says that human beings, Homo sapiens, I mean to call all these groups human beings, so sorry about that, but that Homo sapiens outcompeted and possibly fought or battled different of these human species. So it would say that, in fact, that human beings or Homo sapiens fought with these other members of the Homo genus for territory, perhaps sometimes even in interspecies wars, directly fighting, not just competing abstractly for resources. And eventually, the humans just overran these other members, these other species of humans. The interbreeding theory says, on the other hand, that as human beings, or as Homo sapiens spread out across the Eastern Hemisphere and encountered these different groups, they actually interbred with them. So according to the second theory, there should be genetic differences marking the difference between, marking these different instances where human beings bred with these other Homo species. So for example, it could be that, you could find that people living in China happen to have some genetic traces from these pre-existing Homo species that people living in Europe did. And then likewise, Europeans might have traces of genetic material from Neanderthals. And in fact, in recent years, when these studies have been conducted, it has been found that 1% to 4% of unique Neanderthal DNA is present in modern people of European or Middle Eastern descent. So it does seem that the Homo sapiens that migrated into Europe interbred with Neanderthals, who were in the process of speciating, but weren't yet completely different species from human beings at this point. At the same time, it also appears that up to 6% of unique Denisovan DNA is found in modern Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. So this suggests that as Homo sapiens migrated east, they also encountered Denisovans and interbred with them and carry some of their genetic traits on. Now, this does not sort of exonerate the human species and suggest that we didn't drive these other, this doesn't exonerate Homo sapiens and suggests we didn't drive these other species of Homo into extinction. This is not enough DNA to suggest that there was widespread interbreeding with either Denisovans or Neanderthals. What instead is likely to have happened is that as Homo sapiens encountered these other species of human beings, they drove these competitor hominins to extinction wherever they encountered them. And this might have been that they did this either through competition over resources or outright violence and genocide. So it seems like the replacement theory is to some extent right, because the genetic material here is not enough to suggest there was some sort of equal contribution to modern humans' genetic code. But it seems that in more than a few cases, some members of the losing species in these conflicts, that is the non-Homo sapien species, joined and interbred with their sapien competitors. And so it seems that we had some allies from these other Homo species and that they contributed genetic material to our DNA. Now, a question naturally arises here, and this is a question that we're really going to be interested in throughout the course of this term, and that is, how were Homo sapiens able to so reliably outcompete their fellow human beings? And so that's a question that Harari turns to in chapter 2 of this book. And so chapter 2 is concerned with the cognitive revolution. And the cognitive revolution that Harari is talking about here, he's talking about a revolution in the way that human minds work that occurred in evolution. You may sometimes hear, if your studies continue in cognitive science, the idea of a different cognitive revolution referred to. And that cognitive revolution is much more recent. What people are talking about when they talk about the cognitive revolution, typically in cognitive science, is the revolution away from behaviorism and towards thinking and discussing cognitive processes in the mind, actually the same kind of revolution that prefigured the creation of cognitive science as an interdisciplinary project. But Harari, again, is talking about something that happened in human evolutionary history. And so that's what he's talking about here. And so what's the story here? Well, the idea is, okay, Homo sapiens already populated East Africa 150,000 years ago. But around 70,000 years ago, something happened. Something very impressive started happening with Homo sapiens. They left Africa around this point, that's true, and they eventually drove their competitor hominins to extinction across Europe and Asia. This is what we've just been talking about. Then they crossed the open sea 45,000 years ago, landing in Australia. Some millennia later, between 30,000 and 15,000 years ago, they crossed the land bridge into North America, and eventually they conquered the Western Hemisphere as well. And now in each of these instances, it really can be portrayed as conquering the new territory that they found. In each instance, not only did other Homo species pay a huge price for the influx of Homo sapiens, but additionally, the megafauna paid a huge price as well. I believe there were 18 large megafauna weighing more than 100 pounds in Australia, maybe more than 200 pounds in Australia, when human beings first made it to the island. And only one of those is alive now. And most of them were dead within a few thousand years of human beings landing there. This is all discussed in more detail in Harari's book, if you care to read later chapters on your own. But I think it's very interesting to see just how quickly and how suddenly human beings really began to dominate the world around them. Additionally, between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago, Homo sapiens also invented boats, oil lamps, bows and arrows, sewing needles, art, and religion. So all of this stuff happened after this period, after this period 70,000 years ago that Harari again refers to as the cognitive revolution. And why does he call it the cognitive revolution? Well, because scientists believe that none of this stuff would have been possible without some chance genetic mutations rewiring our brains and allowing us to think and talk in new ways. And this is what Harari refers to as the cognitive revolution, the revolution in our brains that allowed us to think in these impressive new ways. Well, what ways were we now able to think in? What kinds of changes to thought are discussed here? It's now believed that Homo sapiens living after the cognitive revolution exhibit certain patterns of thought and language that other human species were never capable of. And so what were those patterns? Harari discusses two of these patterns in detail. And so one is the pattern that I'll refer to as fictional thinking. So that's the ability to think about abstract or non-existent entities. And then the other is what we might refer to as flexible thinking. And that's just the ability to acquire new ideas and to change existing ideas and stories very quickly. So let's take a look at both of these in turn. So let's talk first about fictional thinking. And usually here, we might talk about fictional thinking, but we have in mind here also talking about fictional things, since presumably language and communication is the reflection of thought, and it's meant to convey thought in some way. So we're going to think about the capacity to think about fictions and to talk about fictions. As Harari points out, other animals have languages. It's just that their languages are not as, lack certain features that ours do. And one of these is fictional thinking. Now, it's clear, right, as I was just saying, that many animals, in addition to humans, communicate. So just some examples of this. Of course, it's true that bees convey information about potential hive sites to one another, as those of you who have taken freshman studies in recent years or are taking it now will learn in great detail. Vervet monkeys, similarly, are capable of alerting one another to the presence of predators in their environment. They have different calls to identify different kinds of predators. So they might say, eagle, one call can identify eagles, while another identifies snakes. And my cat notifies me that his food bowl is empty by positioning himself in front of it and just staring up at me for a while, right? So clearly he is communicating with me in these cases. He's wanting me to notice something, right? So communication is widespread in the animal kingdom, but in each of these cases, what is conveyed is information about an actually observed feature of the present environment. But humans, on the other hand, are able to think and communicate about lots of different things. We're able to talk about things not in the present, so we can talk about things in the past, a storm I watched yesterday or the next president. We can talk about things that we've never observed, but that we suppose exist. So we can talk about, for example, Planet 9, a planet that has been suggested to exist in the outer reaches of our own solar system, which would explain some of the behavior of Neptune. And we also are able to think and communicate about non-observable things that are merely thought to exist. So we're able to discuss strings in the sense of physics, string theory, or God, right? And these are things that we could really never hope to observe firsthand. It's hard to imagine a human perceptual system observing the infinite power of God. But we may still think that these things exist. We're also able to think about things that are thought not to exist at all. So we can consider what unicorns are like, or we can think about alternate realities, even if we don't suppose that there are any actual alternate realities. And so in each of these cases, we're thinking and communicating about something that is, in a certain sense, fictional or not present in our environment. All of these things Homo sapiens can talk about and think about that others can't might be said to be non-occurrent, right? And that just means that they're not referring to things that are occurring in our environment, that are observable by us in the current environment, or if we were to, go somewhere at that very moment. And so this capacity to talk about non-occurrent things undergirds a number of impressive human abilities. So, for example, human beings are able to engage in counterfactual reasoning. We're able to entertain what would happen if we behaved in some different way, right? And we're actually able to imagine what would be the case if it didn't rain during the month of July when we're planting crops, for example. So we're able to engage in this kind of counterfactual reasoning at a very high level that other animals aren't. We also have the capacity to grasp concepts of the supernatural. And it's not clear that other animals have any supernatural beliefs, but human beings, of course, it's widespread, widely known that human beings have very many supernatural beliefs. And this seems to be only possible because we can entertain the possibility of non-occurrent things. Additionally, we seem to have the ability to adopt abstract causal concepts, such as a binding contract or a natural law. And as Harari discusses, we can also create lots of other social constructs, such as companies. All of these are ways of thinking and talking that are made possible by whatever occurred during the cognitive revolution, and they separate us from other members of our genus, other humans that have existed historically. Now, the capacity for these new abilities goes a long way in explaining how Homo sapiens were able to conquer the world starting 70,000 years ago. For just one example, we might consider Scott Atran's claim that religions allow for trust and therefore cooperative behavior between vast networks of unrelated human beings, right? So the thought here is our ability to think of non-occurrent things, in this case, a supernatural being, a god, allows us to develop religion, and religion in turn allows us to cooperate with people we've never met. How does it do that? Well, the thought here is, think about like other animals, wolves, for example. Wolves cooperate with one another, and they're known as social beings, but they only ever cooperate with members of their particular pack that they've spent hours and hours with. Humans, however, can cooperate with people they've only just met. And Scott Atran's thought is that religions and belief in God developed as a way of ensuring or allowing for these kinds of cooperative behavior with people we've just met. If I'm interacting with you and I don't know you very well, I might not be able to trust you. But the thought here is, if I know you worship the same God that I do, and I know that you're following the edicts and rules of that God on pain of like your supernatural or your eternal soul, then I know that I can trust you in business. I know you're going to be acting according to the same moral code that I am. And for that reason, we're going to be able to do business together, to trust one another. So this is just one theory, but it does suggest, right, that a way in which maybe these kinds of counterfactual reasoning would allow us to compete very well against other humans. And I actually invite you to think about some other ways in which this kind of non-occurrent thinking might be useful. Now, the other component here, the other component of the cognitive revolution is what's referred to as flexible thinking, or what I've referred to as flexible thinking. Earlier, I mentioned the human species, Homo erectus, and Homo erectus evolved about 2 million years ago. And it seems that they evolved this capacity to make stone tools in a new way, in a way that never had been seen on Earth before. These are some of these tools. They're called Odoalian axes. The flaking skill here is particularly good and able to render a sharper axe, okay? But this capacity, this behavior, this ability to make this tool seems to have been an evolved trait. It wasn't that Homo erectus thought of a new way to design a better axe. No, they evolved a trait to start flaking rocks in this way. And indeed, they were one of the longest lived human species. They lived for 2 million years. And throughout their whole existence, they never improved upon this axe model, okay? So that suggests that this is a genetic disposition. This behavior, this way of thinking about making tools is a genetic disposition that was innate to them. It was hard won over genetic time as different members of our genus evolved into new creatures. But human beings, right, are able to very quickly change their patterns of thought and behavior. And this is reflected both in tool making and other social behavior. Look here. So this is a series of Gillette razors. So Gillette razors by the Gillette Razor Company from 1900 to 2014. And we can see just how these razors have changed over time. If you know anything about planned obsolescence within the razor industry, you know that humans are always inventing a better razor, a better way to shave. Those kinds of inventions are reflective or create, in fact, our culture. The ability to improve upon previous tools that we've built allows us to create culture, which is subject to its own evolutionary forces. And this also allows us to learn. We have this highly flexible capacity for learning that other creatures don't. So we don't have to sit around and wait to evolve in order to spread into new and different environments. Other organisms, think about sea creatures like dolphins or whales, which are actually evolved from land mammals of a previous millions of years ago. They had to wait to conquer those sea environments until their noses migrated to the top of their heads. But human beings are able to do that by creating new inventions through the highly flexible ways of thought that we have that allow us to develop culture in an incredibly short time, much shorter than natural selection would allow through evolution. Okay, I want to say just a word now about chapter 3, and I'm going to wrap up there. So we've talked just a bit about these kind of flexible thinking capacities that humans have, and the kind of the capacity to form new fictional entities to think about. But I want to be clear that on top of this flexible thinking exists on top of evolved psychological traits, right? Though Homo sapiens have unprecedented capacities for flexible thought, chapter 3 of Harari's book makes clear that there are aspects of human thought and behavior that are strongly innately determined. And this is going to be of a great deal of interest to us through the course of this term. So for example, one example that Harari mentions is the idea that it's widely accepted that the desire to gorge on high calorie food is hardwired into our genes. Makes perfect sense as to why this would be the case, since caloric intake was critical in the ancestral environments in which human beings evolved, right, where food was scarce. So it makes perfect sense that we would have this capacity, and it is widely accepted now that we do have a desire for high calorie food hardwired into us. Additionally, humans seem hardwired for avoidance reactions to spiders and snakes. You may have noticed this in the past, you turn around and see a stick behind you when you're outside and jump backwards thinking it was a snake almost automatically. Well, it turns out that when infants were shown pictures of different animals, then compared to other animals, even 6-month-old infants responded specifically to pictures of spiders and snakes with increased pupil dilation. So it seems that we do have this hardwired kind of avoidance reaction or avoidance behavior to spiders and snakes. And so what other kinds of processes and behaviors and thought patterns are built into the human mind or hardwired into the human mind? So the human mind is not, or at least not entirely, a general purpose computational system. But it seems to include, and this is something we're going to emphasize quite a bit later on, it seems to include a diversity of systems, each devoted to specific subtasks. And now it seems that my slide is messing up here, but I wanted to point out another quick example of a subsystem that the human mind seems to have that's quite striking. And so this is provided by a psychological experiment called the Wason selection task. And so I'm just going to perform this on you now. So I want you to consider the following. So here it is, the Wason selection task. Okay, so first of all, look at these 4 cards. Okay, and now consider this rule. Any card with an even number on it must be red on the other side. Okay, so any card with an even number on it must be red on the other side. So suppose that the 3 has a color on the back of it, the 8 has a color on the back of it, the red card has a number on it, and the green card has a number on it. So any card with an even number on it must be red on the other side. And now the question is, which of these cards would you need to turn over to tell whether or not this claim was true? And I want you to think about only those cards you have to turn over and not turning over any of the cards you don't have to turn over. So which are the specific cards you would have to turn over to tell whether or not this claim was true? Come up with your decision. Okay, well, the answer is you need to turn over, but only need to turn over the 8 card and the brown card to assess this claim. I realize I called that card green earlier. I am colorblind, and so I will eventually make these mistakes in class. I'm not actually sure what color that is, green or brown, but you can be the judge of it. But the important thing is you need to turn over, and you only need to turn over the 8 card and the brown card to assess this claim. Why? Well, the claim is any card with an even number on it must be red on the other side. So the rule would be violated if we turned over the 8 and it wasn't red. And the rule would also be violated if we turned over that green or brown card and it had an even number on the other side. But the other 2 cards don't matter. This rule doesn't say anything about odd numbers. And it doesn't say anything to the effect that all red cards must have even numbers on them. It just says if it's an even card, then it'll be red on the back. So if you didn't get that right, don't feel bad. Most people screw it up. In fact, in Introduction to Cognitive Science, I normally do this in front of an audience. And I'd say probably maybe 25% to a third get it right, and most people miss it. But now consider this other case. So consider the same problem. This is analogous to the previous case. And I want you to consider the following rule. Anyone drinking alcohol must be over 21. Now, suppose each of these cards stands for a person, you see either what they are drinking or how old they are. So here are the cards. So on the left, we have a 19-year-old. He's drinking something, but we don't know what it is. Next to him, we've got someone drinking a Coke. We don't know how old they are. Then a 25-year-old, we don't know what they're drinking. Then someone drinking a beer, and we don't know how old they are. So the question is, which of these cards do you need to flip over, supposing the other side of the card gives you the other information, either what the person's drinking or how old they are? Which of these cards do you need to flip over to tell if this rule is being obeyed? Okay, I bet most of you got this right. The correct answer is that you need to turn over the 19 to make sure that 19-year-old's not drinking an alcoholic beverage, and the beer to make sure that's not a teenager drinking that beer. But the other two are irrelevant. We don't care how old the Coke drinker is, and we don't care what the 25-year-old is drinking. Why were we able to do this so much quicker than the previous waste and selection task? These are analogously the same, right? These puzzles are analogously the same. Well, the reason seems to be that the human mind evolved to have specific mechanisms for social policing that exploit rules we're clumsy at using in other contexts. So the thought is that you have a little mechanism in your mind that is a social policing mechanism. And indeed, if we take this, something totally analogous to this, where it's a social policing situation, but apply it to something irrelevant you don't know about, something not to do with drinking alcohol, but say like how old someone has to be at the dance, you'll just as quickly exploit this rule to make the correct decision there as well. So it looks like humans have a special mechanism for social policing, not a general purpose logic mechanism. And so this suggests again that there's some kind of underlying mechanisms that make up the human mind. Those are part of the human mind as well. It's not only this creative, flexible thinking, it's also these underlying dedicated systems, processes, beliefs, desires, and other innate aspects of the human mind, right? The mind is not simply a general purpose, abstract reasoning machine. So now I want to conclude. And again, we're going to explore all of this much further when we go, as we continue in the class. But I want to conclude now by thinking about something that's brought up in the last bit of your reading for today from Harari. And that is just a series of questions about human nature that Harari asks. And so those would include, they're all about our nature. So he asks, are we by nature monogamous or polygamous? Are we peaceful or warlike? Are we spiritual? And there's some evidence to suggest that we're innately some of these things more than others. Maybe there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that we are innately spiritual, but very ambiguous information to settle the debate over monogamy or polygamy. So those are all questions that we're trying to sort out in cognitive science. And those are questions that we're going to be investigating over the course of the term. We'll be looking into these and related questions throughout the term. Okay, that's it for the primer on human evolution. I hope you now have a better sense of what a human mind is as we move forward in the course. Look forward to the other video for this week, which will bear on System 1, System 2, and the availability heuristic. I'll see you soon. Bye.